Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mopariola. If you have been following the news lately, then you would agree that recent years have seen a growing trend with extreme weather conditions fueled by climate change, creating record-breaking environmental after effects in Africa and around the world. From rapid urbanization to dense population, everyday events continue to show how irresponsible humanity have become in preserving the elements of nature, taking it slow to heed the warning of global warming. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on global efforts aimed at tackling climate change? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report and Africa Today. We'll be right back. Welcome.
Climate change is the leading global environmental threat confronting agriculture. Its impact on crops is having a direct impact on food production in different parts of Nigeria. As Nigeria is projected to be the world's third most populous country by the year 2050, and with a fall in food production, experts fear that there might be more shortage in food production in the nearest future.
As we all know, there are speculations that in 2050 Lagos will be underwater. So you're going to be seeing us. You're going to be seeing us. You're going to be seeing us on TV. You're going to be hearing a lot of things on the radio, the newspapers, and stuff.
We urge everyone to join us with this strategy so that we sensitize the people, because with awareness, people can begin to engage and to try to bring sustainable solution to the climate change threats in Lagos State and Nigeria.
The Policy Dialogue Forum is focused on reviewing challenges and recommending potential interventions that will help address conflicts and support sustainable improvement in agricultural productivity.
Our goal is to look at the existing policies at the national level and see how we can bring about an alignment in terms of the research work we have done to see realistically how some of these existing policies can be implemented to inform different levels of intervention from government.
We feel that world leaders are not paying serious attention to this issue. As world leaders and governments gather in Katowice, we hope that our message would reach them, but we also carry in our hearts a message of hope. And in our journey, we have encountered many people, and it has given us a better understanding of how together, as a human family, we can stand together and conquer this crisis.
We see a climate change. One of the song is, in the song you hear a snow. Normally in this time on Poland, it was a snow. Do you see some snow now? You see already some climate changes even now.
Before we get into the discussion of the day, let's update you on some top news stories around Africa. Director of Kenya's pipeline company and 4 others have been arrested after a million litres of petrol went missing in dubious circumstances. Ebola has spread to a major city in eastern DRC as health experts worry whether the stock of experimental vaccine will stand up to the demands of an epidemic with no end in sight. While lush green fields blanket northern Egypt's Nile Delta, reports say the country's agricultural heartland and its vital freshwater resources are under threat from a warming climate. And now joining me in the studio to look at global efforts aimed at tackling climate change is Oluwafemi Adegoke, chartered waste and environmental consultant. And I'll be having on Skype Sarah Shaw, an international program coordinator for climate change, justice, energy and Friends of the Earth International, and she joins me from the UN Summit in Poland. Good to have you both on the program tonight. Now let me begin with you now, Oluwafemi. Let's start with your thoughts on the growing concerns of climate change. What are your thoughts on this and the efforts to deal with this environmental challenge?
Okay. Climate change is real. That was the first thing. My first thought is that it's staring us in the face. even in the coming years, if nothing strategically is done, we're going to see worse days because of our over-reliance on fossil fuels all over the world. Presently, the COP24 going on in Katowice in Poland is to address how the strategy will be adopted to actualize the Paris Agreement, which some Western world countries are shying away from. But the truth is we need to address this because even locally, we're feeling the effect. Even Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents because we have really not contributed much to the climate change, but we are having the hazard effect.
That's mean African countries do not have any. We don't contribute to what we.
We don't contribute too much
in terms of the global warming we experience.
Yes.
How is that?
Because if you look at our carbon emission in Africa, we're not industrialized.
Okay.
We're not like the Western worlds who have actually depleted the ozone layer, releasing greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So that is what has brought about the climate change. And what led to this UNFCCC's convention yearly that has been addressing how do we combat this, how do we stop this. So Africa now is a developing nation, continent.
Yes.
We need to be looking at zero carbon neutral technologies or low carbon growth. So that's what we should be looking at.
Now, talking about climate change, some of us don't understand what exactly its effects are on the environment in Africa. For instance, now you're saying that we do not, contribute so much in terms of global warming to what we experience. What are those effects of climate change that we get to see on a regular basis if we're to say we are being affected by climate change?
Okay, I'm not saying we're not contributing at all.
All right.
We do contribute because of our reliance on fossil fuels.
Okay.
That's the major, but the problem, one of the effects, let me bring it home quickly. If you look at the Earth's trouble we have, the desertification, it is majorly because of climate change. The desert encroachment into the space, that is why Earth's now have to even move further inland to graze their animals. And we're having that in Nigeria staring us in the face.
Well, let me quickly come to you now. Sarah Shaw, joining me via Skype from the UN Summit in Poland. From what the analysis has been put forward, definitely climate change is a serious matter because we have world leaders gathered again to argue over the goals required to reduce carbon dioxide emission. Tell us more about the discussion so far.
So the discussions so far in Poland, we've seen very little progress, really. I think we are very concerned. We are in a state of climate emergency. We're probably in the last decade, the last sort of 10 years, when we can really get emissions under control. We've seen important scientific reports this year from the IPCC talking about this narrow window to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And we've seen that emissions have reached an all-time high. But what's actually happening in the talks here seems very disconnected from that reality outside and from the impacts that are happening in countries across the world, but particularly in the global south. We've seen very slow progress on agreements to provide finance for the transition to a clean, renewable economy in the south, and for an energy transformation. We've seen very little in terms of finance for adaptation and to pay for the kind of loss and damages that are happening that cannot be adapted to. And we're seeing just extremely slow progress in all aspects. I think countries got together a few years ago at the Paris climate talks, and there was a lot of fanfare for the Paris Agreement. But the commitments that have been made under that are not enough, they're not sufficient. And we see that there's just not enough movement towards the radical action that we need. And we see particularly that wealthy countries are blocking that.
Right, but talking about not enough movement in terms of, addressing this issue of climate change, why do we have this slow progress so far, despite, the dangers that climate change has on the environment in general?
I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of interest working against getting the right outcomes. There's a lot of corporate influence here, big dirty energy companies. We see that there is a coal company sponsoring the conference here. We see also as well, I think, a rise of leaders around the world who are denying that climate change is taking place and who are reversing climate policies. So it's a very difficult sort of political situation at the moment to get that kind of progress.
And talking about, okay, fine, but sorry for breaking your thoughts, but talking about the coal companies now, who you say are, behind this climate change we see in our environment today, what has been done to, make them shift from this practice, from this business that they believe or they know, which contributes to the environmental disaster among us today?
Well, I think one thing that's really important is we need to see a just transformation of the energy system. So we do need an end to fossil fuels. We do need an end to these kind of the extraction of coal, oil and gas. And we need that very, very urgently. But what's really important is that happens in a just way that protects the workers in those industries, their families, their communities. And so it's important that it's the right kind of transformation. So I think fossil fuel companies do not have the interests of their workers and those communities at heart. They are wanting to stay in business. They're wanting to continue to extract and exploit and get the most out of that for a very short-term gain.
Right.
And that's a very powerful influence. There's a lot of money there. There's a lot of influence over politicians and decision makers.
And so we just have to hope the right transformation is followed in due time so that perhaps we can get this behind us. Sarah Shaw, I'd like to thank you very much for your insights on Africa today.
Thank you very much.
All right, need to go on a quick break and be back with more on the global efforts aimed at tackling climate change and the ongoing COP24 summit in Poland. Now, when it comes to climate change, Africa is often in the eye of the storm with fast-growing cities where extreme weather continues to threaten a rapidly expanding populations, making the continent the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. World leaders have converged for the latest climate conference in Katowice, Poland, to discuss the implementation of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which aims to lower greenhouse gas emissions globally to limit the worst effects of climate change. Well, I still have Oluwafemi Adegoke with me in the studio, and we're discussing this matter critically. Now, from what Sarah Shaw pointed out, there are coal companies who find it very difficult to let go of a business that they've got to grow with over time, a generational business, more or less. And this is a contributor, that's the coal, is a contributor to the climate change we see in our environment today, causing global warming. So how would you relate with that, from what you just pointed out, to what we also have to experience in our own continent, in Africa as well?
Okay, like I said earlier on, over-reliance on fossil fuels.
Right.
Let's bring that home to Nigeria now. We have oil and gas companies. And we have gas flaring, which is a major problem in this part of the world, in Nigeria presently. And like she said, the coal companies in Poland, they are holding on to what they've known. Just the same way we have that in Nigeria. The oil and gas companies will not let go. They will tell you that it is cheaper to flare the gas than to capture and bottle it and use it positively. But on the long run, on the long term, it is more costly to flare the gas than
to bottle it up.
Yes.
But so how can we get to transform this belief so they get to understand that, okay, perhaps it is a long, it's going to be a long process, but how can we get them to transform that practice into something more renewable, which is far from, the dangers we have in our environment?
Yeah, the first thing is the political will. Our policies needs to be domiciled locally here. Our government needs to begin to do what I call a bottom-to-top approach and not top-to-bottom. What do I mean?
Right.
Our local government, our state government needs to be more involved in this, and the people needs to be aware about what is going on. We need to domicile the climate change policy offices in our local government. Because that is when the people who actually feel the impact understand their own responsibility. So what we're doing right now is a top-to-bottom approach, and the people just get the impact. They don't know what's causing
it. Right. So more or less awareness is a key.
Yes, and for the oil and gas company, there's what they call neutral carbon technology. They can still do their business, but they just need a cleaner technology to do it that has little or no effect on the atmosphere.
Right. Now I have my guest on Skype as well, Siriram Madhu Sudonan of Corporate Accountability, and he joins me from Poland. I hope I got your name correctly. Thank you very much for your time with us on Africa Today. So what do you make of the climate talks in Poland, and what are some of the key issues being raised by your organization?
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for having me. One of the key issues our organization and a growing movement around the world have been raising is, I think, very much the fact, as Sarah was mentioning earlier, that the progress that needs to be made in these climate talks is vast, and yet the pace of progress is incredibly slow. And one of the reasons for that is the very fact that those who profit the most from fueling this crisis are very much still in the room, delaying and undermining necessary action to address the climate crisis.
So, but what will it take now to get them to push up, the efforts to contain greenhouse gases in the atmosphere?
Yes, it's a very good question. I mean, I think first and foremost, what we need to make sure is that this conference of parties, which, by the way, has been happening for 24 years, is a place where the power of the people and the needs of the people directly impacted by the crisis. And those interests are put forward, where it's a space that climate justice really advances. And in order to do that, we really must protect policymaking from the profiteering interests of the industry that really, in order to protect its profits, has for decades delayed and misled the public around the world on the threats of climate change and the need to very quickly transition in a just way off of fossil fuels and to a renewable, community-controlled energy system.
And talking about outcomes, what are you expecting from next week's talks on this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you know, I think that those outcomes remain to be seen. The negotiations are happening right now. I think the big question is whether what comes out of these will ultimately be padding the profits of those who have for far too long profited richly, made hundreds of billions of dollars every year off of extracting and burning fossil fuels, or whether it's going to instead center a just transition, center human rights, indigenous sovereignty, and what the world really needs in this moment. And in order to do that, we really do need to take a long, hard look at who's in the room and what their interests are in being inside the room. Is it climate justice, or is it protecting their business model, which is driving us to the brink of planetary catastrophe?
Now, talking about what to be done now, what the talks on climate change, do you think it will count this time, especially for Africa?
Yes, very good question. You know, I mean, I think that kind of really cuts to the core of the issue of climate justice, right? So who, when we talk about the parties in the room or the corporations in the room and where they're based, have historically emitted the most carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, and who, when we're talking about countries in the African continent, are also small island states who are feeling very directly the impacts of the climate crisis right now, are paying the costs of it. You know, it gets to one of the issues that we've launched, campaigns that we've worked on with people's movements around the world, which is the people's demands for climate justice, and the fact that in order to center a just transition and one that really delivers for climate justice, we need these demands to be heard. And one amongst those is climate finance and ensuring a fair share and equity in the outcomes of the climate agreement, that those who have historically contributed to it are also the ones that are really covering the transition and what needs to happen.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sira Madhusudanan of Corporate Accountability, all the way from Katowice, Poland. Which I appreciate your insights on Africa today as well.
Thank you.
Now let's wrap up the show with you now. Oluwafemi, from what is posited so far, it's definitely not different from what you've said rightly also as well. But, you know, let's still look at this environmental threat where many still don't believe that it exists. For instance, the United States president called it a hoax, and some still believe that perhaps it's just another talk shop where world leaders gather again, talk about all this, and after it, you know, it's back to square one altogether. So what can we do to enlighten the minds of persons who believe that global warming doesn't have any negative effect whatsoever on the planet we call home?
Okay. Like I said earlier on, what we need to do, because political will, I've said, our government, we need to speak, we need to create awareness among the people and let them see it. Like I gave example of the Earth's men, the desertification, which has led to the Earth's men moving around,
right?
Like not like they were used to. So that's one of the effects of climate change. And even we can see flooding, excessive flooding in some places in Nigeria in recent years is as a result of climate change as well. So we need more awareness, and that was why I was talking about the domiciling climate change discussion in the local authority.
But we have awareness. People have been hearing about this, but it's still believed that it's nothing. It's perhaps because, sorry, let me quickly land on why I'm saying this, because there is this belief that, you know, the climate definitely has a melting point, and afterwards it will come back again to its, you know, starting point all over. For instance, you have the melting ice caps. Now, once it's melted to a certain degree, it will definitely go, you know, come back to ice again. So it's a normal circle we have on the planet. So why call it a trouble? Why call it something we should worry about when it is a normal change of the planet, of the Earth? So if that is what some people believe, and it's definitely termed as a hoax, How then do you want to justify, for instance, that all that we see is a cause of climate change, so we have to be careful, we have to be wary of what we do, we have to be cautious of emissions and all of that stuff. How can we be able to, put a line, draw a line to say, okay, this is bad and this is good? How do we do that?
Okay, there are empirical informations that's, like you said, that shows that it's a cycle. But we have been distorting the cycle by excessive emission of greenhouse gases. And that is why we need to begin to live responsibly. Behavioral change needs to start from the local people. The people need to know why they're doing what they're doing. Like I'll give you a quick example. Our waste management is not responsible. We just use and dump. But now we have what we call a circular economy. Use and reuse and reuse. You don't just use and dump. Then you dump, it gets burnt, it releases greenhouse gases, goes to the atmosphere, depletes the ozone layer quicker than what it's supposed to be. So that's the effect. So it's not a hoax. We're making it, let's say it's supposed to take 200 years for a cycle. We're making it happen in 50 years. And that's dangerous. So he's not going through his nature. Natural cycle. We are distorting the nature now.
Right.
So that's why we need to create awareness, and we need to begin to live responsibly. We need to stop our over-reliance on fossil fuel. We need to begin to look at renewable source of energy, like the sun, the wind. We need to look at organic waste, which is abundant here, and we can use that to generate our energy. We need to decentralize our energy generation.
All right. Let's leave it at that. And thank you very much, Oluwafemi Idowu Adegoke, Chartered Waste and Environmental Consultant. We appreciate your analysis on Africa today.
Thank you very much.
Well, Africa finds itself worst affected by the effects of global warming as resources become degraded and biodiversity is being disrupted to the point where the future of life as we know it on Earth really looks bleak. Well, the way forward is to go green by choosing reduce, reuse and recycle until humanity and nature finds the system to adopt and the solutions to adapt for all to thrive and leave footprints of sustainable development for generations to come. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one again, I am Esther Hamopariola, and always remember, Africa can only get better.